Is the mind different from the body? I think this question is rather similar to, is form or pattern different from substance? If I had a gold sphere, I can think of it as being divided into two different things. It has its pattern, or its shape, or its form, and that's the sphere. And I can also divide it into the substance of what that sphere is made out of, which is going to be gold. But the thing is that dividing this single entity up into two different things, pattern and substance, is actually a mental construct. It's an abstraction. That division isn't an actual feature of reality, it's just something that we've done within our minds. And the mind is fantastic at actually breaking up the unity of the universe. We seem to do that all the time. I'm sitting in a room. In front of me is a music stand with a phone that I'm currently recording on. To my right is a piano and a window, and I can see buildings past the street and know that there's a lake beyond that. And I think of all of these things as being separate from each other. But within the field of quantum mechanics, we end up finding that all space touches. So if I had a particle, and I end up splitting this particle, and I end up sending one half of that to the other end of the galaxy, and now I influence the one, I can affect the other one without going through space or time. It does so simultaneously. In fact, that's actually what Einstein referred to as spooky action at a distance. So, two places in space can influence each other without supposedly going through space or time in between. It's a spontaneous interaction. So, the universe is a unity, it's a whole, but we've divided this up into separate pieces and fragments. And again, I think this is all done within the mind. And separating the mind and the body into two different things, again, is an artificial way of dividing up the world. It's just two ways of experiencing one process. We can say that you can experience it through thought, or extension, or pattern and substance. Now, I kind of want to look at both of these a little bit individually. And I want to see if I can find a way of showing the underlying unity existing between these two. And I want to start with the body. Now, the body is composed of 300 trillion cells. And again, that number is an approximation. It turns out to be really difficult to quantify cells. And 300 trillion is the estimate I've recently heard, and I'm going to go with that. But anyways, these 300 trillion cells are an ecosystem of living organisms. And I would say that each and every single one of these cells could be thought of as a living organism, each and every one of them, with their own unique interests and their own boundaries. But what's interesting is that, although they may be separate, they're harmoniously working together for a common good. And that common good can be said to be yourself or your body. And if any of these individual cells were to pursue their individual interests for too long, what you end up seeing is diseases like cancer. That's the result of these cells taking their own interests over the interests of the whole. Now, I think that each and every one of these living organisms, or these cells, can be thought of as musicians in a jazz band. And these musicians are spontaneously interacting with the improvisations of all the various cells around them. And they're doing so eloquently and so beautifully that it just seems like a single unit. Your body, or an organ within your body, or an organ system, all of these cells harmoniously working together. And again, having all of their separate interests. What's really interesting about that now as well too there is that every single one of these cells, and there's 300 trillion of them, remember that, that's a very mind-boggling number, but every single one of these cells is constantly being renewed. In fact, your entire body is being refreshed constantly. And I think it's in the area of about 7 years. So every 7 years, you replace every single cell in your body. And this is a bit of an interesting conundrum for those who end up thinking that they are their bodies, or that their bodies are primary. And a way of sort of thinking about that is that if I had a car, and say, for example, I had to replace the spark plug after a few weeks, and then unfortunately my tires went out, so I replaced my tires, and then my exhaust, and my transmission, and my frame, and the windows, and the seats, and the seat belt, and the mirrors. And I end up eventually replace every single one of the original parts of my car. Now, is it the same car? And there's a group of people who can end up saying, no, that's not the same car. Because, what we can do is we can end up taking all the various parts that you threw away, and we can end up building the original car again, and they can say, that is the car. Then again, there's another group who can end up claiming that it is the same car, because the relative pattern of the car remained true all the way throughout. Its sense of identity remained true. And you're experiencing the exact same thing. Your body's constantly refreshing itself. It's constantly growing new cells. And we're almost like a whirlpool in a stream. Water's constantly moving through the whirlpool. And that's actually how it ends up maintaining its pattern, or its shape, is it needs a constant supply of water flowing through it. And if we didn't have a constant supply of water, and air, and food flowing through us, our pattern would also end up dissolving. So your body is constantly renewing itself. It's composed of trillions of cells, each with their individual interest. And every single one of those cells can be thought of as an individual musician working harmoniously as a unit, as a whole, and that whole can be thought of as your body. And I think that is a unity within itself, but it's composed of all of these separate living organisms and boundaries. So it ends up creating a pattern, because you always seem to be the same person throughout your lifetime, although your body is constantly renewing itself. So the pattern is always sort of remaining the same. I heard another way of thinking about this. If you end up going to a university, say for example, the buildings end up changing, and the faculty ends up changing, and the students end up changing, and it gets completely replaced and refreshed and constantly renewing itself, where all the original parts eventually may end up being replaced by something else. But it still remains the same university. The pattern of organization remains the same. And that pattern of organization is you, or your cognition, or your mind, or consciousness, or however you want to end up calling it. So that pattern of organization is the mind. And the substance flowing through that, like the water through the vortex, that ends up being the body. So, but these two different aspects, shall we say, the substance and the pattern, are mutually dependent upon each other. It's like a transaction in society, where all of a sudden you buy and you sell. You can't have one without the other. They're always going back and forth. The mind is constantly being able to influence the body, and the body is constantly being able to influence the mind. But to say that there's a cause and effect relationship between the two is just a clumsy way of saying that they're related, or that they're a part of the same process. And I think a lot of the trouble when people think about the mind and the body as being separate is they have this either-or kind of mentality, instead of a both-and way of thinking of things. And this either-or wants a cause and it wants an effect. And a lot of them have said that the body is the cause and then the mind is the effect. But there are examples in which the mind can actually influence the body, where all of a sudden the mind becomes the cause and the body becomes the effect. And let me just kind of give an example here. I used this one a few days ago. If you were driving in the parking lot of a grocery store and somebody ends up pulling in front of you, and you end up evaluating the situation against your favor, and you judge the situation in such a way that you end up producing a feeling of anger. You've evaluated the situation, it was against your favor, things are looking grim. Now that decision, that perspective that you ended up making sense of the universe, ends up changing the pattern, or changing what I refer to as the quantum configuration that eventually ends up manifesting itself into your neural physiology. And that's a dense statement. I'll try to unpackage that a little bit. I think that your mind is the entity capable of influencing the probability of quantum events occurring. So the way that you end up perceiving the universe ends up influencing how your brain states are going to manifest. Every single choice that you end up making, you end up collapsing the infinite potentiality of the universe into a set state. And you're constantly doing that so long as you're aware and alive and the source of your own experience. You're constantly collapsing this infinite potentiality into something concrete, which you end up seeing as being your body. But the thing is, your mind is constantly influencing how that pattern is being created. And then we end up seeing that as our neural physiology. And again, going back to the situation there, it's like your mind, after it ends up perceiving a certain situation through a certain lens, ends up creating a certain emotional state, what ends up looking like a certain neurophysiological state that we can measure and we can look at, and we can take note of certain areas are being influenced within your brain, and we can end up claiming, because that's the only part that we can end up observing, that, it was the brain that ended up creating the state of mind. And sometimes it does. So let's look at the opposite sense now. So there's certain situations where the body does in fact influence the mind, instead of the mind influencing the body. So you have a couple glasses of champagne, or you take some mind-expanding drugs. You'll find out by changing the chemistry of your brain, you can end up changing the pattern of how you end up thinking. So you can end up going from the bottom up. For example, you can end up influencing the bottom, or influencing the body, to eventually end up changing something that ends up happening within your mind, or you can end up changing the patterns within your mind that eventually ends up manifesting itself as changes within your body. But the two go together. They're sort of two poles of the exact same process. It's a single underlying process, but we've divided this process up and we think of it as being one affecting the other, or vice versa, but it's not. It's the same process that seems to be occurring there. So mind and body aren't separate. They're just two different ways of viewing the same entity, or the same process, one through thought and one through extension. But again, they're both mutually supporting each other.